Is Trump mentally unfit to be president? That is an awkward question, but it's one that's being asked on every major news network in America.
President Trump's fitness for office is now the top story in the country.
Reports suggest that even Trump's advisors are worried about it.
Everyone around the president questions his intelligence and fitness for office.
100% of the people around him.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said.
We're joined now by Dr. Bandy Lee, a forensic psychiatrist on the faculty of the Yale School of Medicine and the editor of the new book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. Also joining us, Tony Schwartz.
When silence contributes to harm to the public health, then we do have a duty to speak out.
An historic work in the history of American psychiatry. We have never been in this place before.
You and several of your Democratic House colleagues met with a psychiatry professor from Yale, Dr. Bandy Lee. She told CNN today, quote, "As the president is unraveling, he seems to be losing his grip on reality and reverting to conspiracy theories. There are signs that he is going into attack mode when he is under stress. That means he has the potential to become impulsive and very volatile," unquote.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our conference event by the title, The Dangerous State of the World and the Need for Fit Leadership.
I am a scared American citizen with considerable experience internationally and almost daily experience of the Trump reality around the world. This is a very dangerous world, and President Trump is making it a lot more dangerous.
It is for that reason that we have the 25th Amendment of the Constitution that was adopted in the 1960s to respond to the grave threat to our country if a psychologically imbalanced individual who was incapable of serving as President of the United States were to be in the White House and in control of nuclear weapons.
Managing his moods comes to take up valuable time and space in the media. And the bad judgment caused by one of his worst character flaws, not wanting to take any criticism, can end up in ruinous situations and catastrophe for the nation. Trump is not fit to serve as leader and commander-in-chief of American democracy. But he is fit, entirely, eminently fit to serve as the leader of an authoritarian state.
Acts of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and terrorism have been preceded by periods in which political and social movements employed just this rhetoric. One way to control someone is through force. A much better way to control someone, though, is by changing their obligations to make them what you want. If you make someone think that what they ought to do is what you want them to do, that's much better than forcing them.
There's a deafening silence in the public about these questions at this depth. So what happens when citizen action begins, community discussions, churches, temples, that kind of university discussion? It is really important to get beyond the quiet, the deafening quiet, that in fact is the march quietly towards whatever Donald Trump and Mr. Bolton want to do to us.
That it is a fallacy of humanity to consider the use of nuclear weapons. Now we fast forward to our current commander-in-chief, a man who not only got us out of the INF Treaty, turned his back on the Iran nuclear agreement, which again prevented the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But he's also the one who fumbled the North Korean nuclear deal.
The clean energy technology solutions are here, I can assure you, as a former acting assistant secretary of energy for energy efficiency and renewable energy. But the grand oil party keeps blocking and mocking what needs to be done. So the nation is in the most dangerous state because President Trump and the Trumpublican Party, the only climate science denying party in the world, reject truth, evidence, and science.
In times of crisis, Individuals regress to a state of delegated omnipotence and demand a leader who will rescue them and take care of them. And that, I would assert, is what is happening in contemporary society. It's a force for human destructiveness when the narcissistically wounded leader rages at the world for depriving him of mirroring and enlists his followers in attacking it.
I offer an analog between Donald Trump and the worst prison guard in my Stanford prison experiment. That student, who by chance was assigned to play a prison guard, soon internalized that role in the extreme. He reported later that he felt as if he were a puppeteer and the prisoners, who were other students, were his puppets, so that he could make them do anything by pulling their strings. This total dehumanization of others reflects a dictatorial mindset that characterizes much of Trump's treatment of everyone.
If you sat down on a bus next to Donald Trump and started a conversation with him, had no idea who he was, within an hour you would be saying to yourself, how did I get next to this crazy person? Who is this blowhard nutcase? The fact is that tens of millions of Americans, many of them well-educated Americans, believe that Donald Trump is a demigod. Not a demagogue, but a demagogue. That should disturb us deeply.
I mean, we all laugh and we say, oh, Donald Trump's like your mad old racist uncle at Thanksgiving dinner. We laugh, we make that analogy. It's not funny, though, because your mad old racist uncle at Thanksgiving dinner isn't the commander-in-chief of the world's most powerful military, doesn't have access to the nuclear codes, isn't in control of the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, the Secret Service, isn't the de facto leader of one of this country's two major political parties.
The nuclear age obviously dramatically changes the stakes of what it means to allow someone who is mentally imbalanced to reach the highest levels of government. At least I wanted to give you some background on the constitutional architecture dealing with this problem and say that there are some people in Congress who are working on this problem, and we will be pushing legislation in this Congress.
I would open the floor only for solutions.
In the history of propaganda, it's a unique situation because the Fox News, which is like his allied media, state media practically, doesn't just parrot the leader as in the past. It's a feedback loop where Trump parrots them.
And I think one of the solutions, or one of the things to do, is precisely the sort of thing that's starting here. And that is to say, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement recognized, and the anti-nuclear movement at one point, the need actually to begin building movements external to just normal politics.
Donald Trump is a symptom of a larger problem, and that problem is the electorate of the United States that put him in office.
It's going to take the point where the people of this country, certainly the people who care about the future of this country, are going to have to step up and say, this is absurd, this is obscene, and it has to change.
Our ethical guidelines state that we have a primary responsibility to patients and to society.
I had the honor of serving on the Presidential Commission on the 25th Amendment, and I totally agree with Dr. Lee.
I think the idea is to avoid absolute disaster right now. And this does not seem to be taken very seriously in our political processes.
What we found through Mr. Mueller's report was alarming. The president failed every criterion for rational and reality-based decision-making capacity. My name is Dr. Bandy Lee. I'm a forensic psychiatrist at Yale School of Medicine. A forensic psychiatrist does evaluations for the courts and testifies before legal or governmental bodies. My views are my own, although I do represent the World Mental Health Coalition as its president. My colleagues and I assessed Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report from a mental health perspective. What we found through Mr. Mueller's report was alarming. The president failed every criterion for rational and reality-based decision-making capacity. Our assessment is definitive. Our recommendations were, first and foremost, to remove Mr. Trump from access to nuclear weapons and war-making powers. We could offer many more, but given the urgency, we decided to focus on the two most important. The instability and impulsivity that led us to the brink of war with Iran should illustrate the importance of mental capacity in a president. His actions are exactly what we would predict from an individual who lacks mental capacity. Much of this may have been preventable if we had regular fitness for duty tests for presidents and vice presidents before they even take office. All military personnel who handle nuclear weapons must pass rigorous psychological testing before they assume their duties and must renew it every year. Yet the person who commands nuclear weapons does not. What we performed was a mental capacity evaluation. It tests function, not diagnosis, and in this case, the ability of someone to make sound decisions free of impulsivity, recklessness, paranoia, and false beliefs. To demonstrate mental capacity, one has to be able to take in information and advice, to appreciate and make flexible use of that information, to consider consequences based on rational, reality-based, and reliable thinking without undue interference from impulsivity, conspiracy theories, emotional needs, or fluctuating inconsistency, and to refrain from behavior that places oneself or others in danger. Mr. Trump showed enough evidence to both allies and opponents, as well as in his incitement to violence in public, that he did not possess these abilities. Our work is not about Mr. Trump, who may not be a danger as a private citizen, but about protecting society against the powers of the presidency in a person who has not demonstrated the ability to handle them. As the evidence was overwhelming, and since outside perspectives are more important in a functional exam than a personal interview, we did not feel we needed one. The wealth and quality of the report's content made this possible. In fact, we had more and better data under sworn testimony than we have ever had in our usual practice. Still, we wish to offer the President the opportunity to present for an exam if he believed himself fit, and we asked him to give us an answer within 3 weeks. While his staff let us know that our request was received, there has been no response about a personal exam. Hence, we proceeded with our conclusion and recommendations. A capacity evaluation is different from a diagnostic exam for the purposes of treating a patient. A diagnosis has nothing to do with a person's ability to function in a job. Many individuals with diagnoses of mental illness get the help they need and function perfectly well at work. We are also not interested in a diagnosis because the President is not our patient. Our primary responsibility is to protect public health and safety, as our professional ethics require. Capacity evaluations are usually performed for employers, not patients, and the employers in the case of a president are the people. Our findings also certify the observations of our public service book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president. We predicted 2 years ago that Mr. Trump would grow worse under the pressures and the powers of the presidency. Having a president who lacks capacity is like having a captain who is asleep at the wheel. Only worse, since many people will not recognize that he is asleep. Not only that, efforts to cover up this lack in Mr. Trump, either by himself or those protecting him, may ignite dangerous situations. Experts who understand these dynamics can educate the public about these distinctions the way we have learned to protect ourselves against the spread of infectious disease. We urge the public to read our report, which can be found on our website, dangerouscase.org, and we urge authorities to follow our recommendations. The security of our nation is at stake. Hello again. My name is Dr. Bandy Lee. I am here today. Next to me is Dr. James Marikangis, and we are here with all the co-authors of our mental health analysis of Robert Mueller's report. What you just saw was first, for the first time ever shown, was our 10-minute highlights video from our interdisciplinary conference, which was held in March of this year, where 13 top experts of the country came together and explained how the president was unfit from each of their perspectives. We discovered why from the mental health analysis that we were able to do from Robert Mueller's report. When the report first came out, we were astonished at the level of the abundance of high quality information that was available to us, allowing us to do a rigorous mental capacity evaluation. Now that's, as explained in the video, a functional test that is done in the service of the public. So we're not treating Mr. Trump as a patient, we are not diagnosing him, we are simply assessing his function. And as you have heard, the results were very disturbing in that he did not meet one criterion of basic mental capacity, which explains why he was unable to meet capacity for any other function, since mental capacity is the foundation for all of these, including presidential capacity, military capacity, and so on. So now we're here today to present various aspects of the report to you, as well as to unveil for the very first time the 5 critical questions we have for Mr. Mueller based on our analysis. We believe these are incredibly important, even though there may not be much of a possibility of getting them asked. But this program is for you, the public, because we feel that the information is important to convey to the public. So again, my name is Dr. Bandy Lee. I'm a forensic psychiatrist and violence expert at Yale School of Medicine. With us today is Dr. Edwin Fisher, clinical psychologist at the Gilling School of Global Public Health, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Leonard Glass, psychiatrist at McLean Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Dr. James Marikangis, neuropsychiatrist and violence expert at George Washington University. And finally, Dr. James Gilligan, psychiatrist at New York University School of Law. We are all co-authors of our report on the Mueller report, and we will present various aspects we have found from the report, starting with Dr. Fisher. Dr. Fisher, would you give us your analysis of our report?
Sure. It's good to be with everybody this evening and this afternoon for those on the West Coast. I'll just repeat a couple of the things that Dr. Lee mentioned both in the video and in her comments to emphasize how the report provided such a great deal of good descriptive information of President Trump's behavior over the last several years. Before, we had anecdotes of his behavior. We had anecdotes that he had said this thing or that thing. But now we saw really the sweep of behaviors, from hearing that the special counsel had been appointed to becoming outraged over that and viewing it as very threatening to him, to asking Mr. McGahn to, or not asking, directing Mr. McGahn to fire the special counsel, etc. And that description of details of behavior over time really solidifies our base for making the conclusion that Mr. Trump is very dangerous and that he lacks the capacity to execute the office that he holds. As Dr. Lee mentioned, we did not make any diagnosis. This is a functional assessment. This is an assessment of the behaviors and the behavior patterns of Mr. Trump. This is very similar to assessments that are commonly done in the armed services for those who have access to dangerous weapons such as nuclear weapons, but it's also done routinely in business and professions. So we ask the question, why should not this be done in assessing the most powerful man on the face of the earth, one who has the power through the weapons he controls to destroy us all?
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. Next, we would like to turn to Dr. Glass. Dr. Glass, can you give us some comments?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to all who are listening in. My comment is in the form of a question that I would ask Mr. Mueller. And it begins, mental health professionals routinely assess individuals for potential dangerousness to themselves and to others. Your report, based on the sworn testimony of allies and opponents of the president, provides clear evidence that Mr. Trump often cannot control his rage, that he lashes out impulsively and vengefully, apparently without weighing the consequences of his actions, that he's typically unwilling or unable to recognize the limits of his understanding, asserting that he is an expert in all things. And he routinely blames others, typically minorities or those who are concerned than he is. These characteristics are seen by me and my colleagues in the psychiatric world very frequently among those who are dangerous to others. And with all of this based on sworn testimony in your report, would you not consider it prudent to have a violence risk assessment of this individual? I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Marikangas, would you like to make any comment about our report?
Well, our report on the Mueller report used sworn testimony, anecdotes, 400 and something pages of evidence about what Trump was actually doing. We didn't have the opportunity to interview him personally, but every day we hear his thoughts in his tweets, his spoken word, and his inability to speak correctly, the mistakes he makes with his pronunciation, elocution, etc., as well as his what appears to be deteriorating memory, bring us to the conclusion that our book, The Dangerous Case of President Trump, the mental health experts' assessment of that, predicted that he would deteriorate under the pressures of the presidency, and that appears to be what's happening. And the way he gins up the crowd with his chants and with his incitement to violence is reminiscent of the Nuremberg rallies that Adolf Hitler had, and that is very, very scary. So we believe that he is a danger to the public, and that's why we are coming forward with the review of the Mueller report and questions that should be answered by Mueller to counteract the false picture of it that was given by Barr and others about his report before it was actually released.
Dr. Gilligan, would you like to add some comments about our report?
Yes, I'm like the other panelists. I think the one of the issues that I'm most alarmed by is Donald Trump's dangerousness. I think he is unique among American presidents throughout our history, as far as I can review, in the degree to which he is inciting violence on the part of the public toward other members of the public or toward other members of the government. For example, I can't recall any president in American history prior to Donald Trump who has urged his followers or reminded them that they could always assassinate his antagonist in the presidential election if they wanted to, saying that if
Hillary Clinton had become elected president and appointed judges whom they disapproved of, that the group he referred to as the Second Amendment folks, meaning gun owners, could always take care of her. Well, of course, the only way you stop somebody using your guns is by shooting them. That's called assassination. Trump has been urging, in addition to that, urging his followers at his rallies to beat up people who oppose him, and said that he would pay their legal fees if they were prosecuted for assault and battery, which many of them were. We've seen on television, seen them beating up people at his rallies. And we know that some of them have been prosecuted for assault and battery. His only complaint about their behavior was they weren't yet being violent enough. He continued to encourage them to become more and more violent. Finally, one of Trump's supporters in Charlottesville ran a truck into a group of pedestrians, actually murdering one of them and grievously injuring many others. Trump's comment, instead of being horrified and condemning that, simply said, well, there were good people and bad people on both sides, creating or asserting a kind of moral equivalency between murder and nonviolent political protest. With respect to atomic weapons, he's asked, what's the use of having nuclear weapons if we can't use them? And then suggested that if ISIS gave us any trouble in the Middle East, why don't we just nuke them? Without indicating where he would drop a thermonuclear weapon. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. I mean, this kind of talk is unbelievably irresponsible on the part of the one person in our country who actually has the power to order the use of those weapons. I could go on, but the point I would make is I don't think that he, like other political leaders, is likely to commit acts of violence himself. The most dangerous and mass homicidal dictators of the 20th century didn't necessarily kill a single human being themselves. They were responsible for the deaths of millions of people because they incited their followers to do it. And that is what Trump is doing. You don't have to examine him personally to see that. It's going on in public, in front of our eyes. You can document it simply by watching the television evidence showing what he says and what other people do. One group of investigators found that there was a threefold increase in hate crimes in the cities that had major Trump rallies compared to the comparable cities that did not have a rally of Trump supporters. I mean, I could go on, but the evidence is overwhelming that this man is dangerous. That's why I would like to ask Mr. Mueller, how inadequate does he feel his report was in assessing Donald Trump's dangerousness, given the fact that Trump refused to be interviewed and refused on the advice of his lawyers, who indicated that they were so worried that he could not tell the truth, that he would wind up committing perjury and therefore being prosecuted for perjury. I would like to ask Mr. Mueller if Trump's constant lying interfered with his ability to determine whether Trump had in fact conspired with the Russian government or its representatives in encouraging them and cooperating with them in the provision of propaganda and misinformation designed to support his being elected and Hillary Clinton's being defeated.
Thank you very much. Based on what Dr. Gilligan was suggesting, our recommendation was to, first and foremost, to remove Mr. Trump from access to nuclear weapons because of the dangerousness and mental incapacity that we found evidence of in Mr. Mueller's report. Secondly, we asked for Mr. Trump to be removed from war-making powers, as someone lacking in mental capacity should not have. And so these were our two most urgent recommendations. I'd like to emphasize that as health professionals, we are not against any human being. We are not anti-Trump. In fact, we consider ourselves pro-human and therefore pro-Mr. Trump as we work toward humanitarian goals. We are also not allowed to let politics enter into our medical assessment. We call this medical neutrality, which means that we do not play down a medical need for political reasons either. This is an essential part of our professional ethics, and this is why we are holding this program so that the public can read our report again through dangerouscase.org. But now we will move on to the 5 critical questions we feel that Mr. Mueller should be asked. We are fully cognizant of the fact that they are unlikely to be asked, but from our perspective, as they concern the immediate security of our nation and the greatest crisis we are facing, which is a mental health crisis, which is why we would like to present them here to help inform you and to receive your questions. And so you are welcome to start typing in your questions as we move forward. But for now, we will start presenting the 5 questions we would urgently like to ask Mr. Mueller based on our analysis of his report. So the first question, which I will propose, is Mr. Mueller, I, as a forensic psychiatrist and many others in the mental health field, often do capacity evaluations for the courts. When people come to court, they have to show that they have the capacity to answer questions or to stand trial, and so on. Were you planning to interview Mr. Trump in person? If you were, what happened that the interview did not occur? Did someone instruct you not to interview him? Given that the information in your report showed us that the president lacks every criterion of rational mental capacity, did you ever consider a capacity evaluation prior to the interview? That would be my question. Now we will move to Dr. Fisher for his question.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. It's a little bit long, but bear with me. Mr. Mueller, in his written responses to your office's questions, President Trump testified, I quote, "I have no recollection of learning at the time that Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, or Jared Kushner was considering participating in a meeting in June 2016 concerning potentially negative information about Hillary Clinton." In additional responses, President Trump denied recollection of related events related to that meeting. Note, he did not claim no knowledge of such events, only that he did not remember knowing about them or remember meeting with Trump Jr., Manafort, or Kushner. One might expect that one would recall clearly either hearing that your son and top campaign advisors were meeting with Russians, or recall clearly that you had no knowledge of such a meeting. You might say something like, "If that had happened, I surely would remember it. I did not know about the meeting, and nobody told me about it." Therefore, it is plausible to conclude that President Trump's claimed inability to recall is deceitful. Now the question for you, Mr. Mueller, does your report provide evidence for a different interpretation than deceit for the president's inability to recall events surrounding the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting?
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. Next, we will turn to Dr. Glass. Would you like to ask your question or repeat your question?
Well, I'd like to do two things since I gave my question in my earlier comments. I'll reiterate it, but first, I'd like to address people who are listening who perhaps may not have a mental health experience or expertise themselves, because I hear the phrase that we use professionally about capacity, and I worry that people listening to this might think we're thinking that he's stupid, he lacks intelligence. And that's not the way professionals use the term. And I hope this doesn't seem condescending, but it's just a point of clarification. We're speaking about the capacity to exercise certain mental functions that involve judgment, that involve control of impulses, that involve reality testing and setting aside overwhelming emotions or preferences for conspiracy theories, the ability to learn from experience, the ability to take responsibility for one's actions, the ability to remember, as Dr. Fisher so clearly underlined, without misrepresenting. So it's not capacity in the way one might use it in common parlance. It's as a professional uses it, describing the capacity to hold executive power and use it in a realistic, responsible, reasonable way. Okay, so just to reiterate my earlier question, we mental health experts have recognized in Mr. Trump, as portrayed by his allies and his enemies under sworn testimony, as possessing the very characteristics that our decades of experience have taught us are the hallmark of dangerous individuals. And given that he had all of that information in front of him, and he had it not just based on what pundits said or impressions from the evening news, but sworn under oath by reliable observers who worked elbow to elbow with the president day after day, why didn't he ask for an evaluation of the president's capacity for violence? This is something that I would think an astute observer like Mr. Mueller, advised by experts, would recognize as arising unmistakably from his report. Why was that not a recommendation?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Glass. We will now turn to Dr. Marikangas.
In court, when a witness is going to testify, one of the things that the judge has to do to see whether that witness is qualified to testify, and one thing that an ethical prosecutor will look into is whether that witness actually knows the difference between truth and unreality. And in the case of President Trump, so many of his statements are clearly erroneous, misstatement, or outright lies. I wonder, Mr. Mueller, whether that was the reason you didn't choose to interview him in person, because you did not want to get him in what his lawyers call a perjury trap, whether it is because of his lack of ability to remember what he said before, or whether what he was going to say was so unreliable as it would simply confuse the record. Is that why you chose not to interview Mr. Trump?
Thank you, Dr. Marikangas. Now we will turn to the last question, which Dr. Gilligan will state.
I would like to ask Mr. Mueller questions concerning assessing Donald Trump's dangerousness also. Given the fact that it's been abundantly demonstrated, objectively documented, that Trump simply tells things that are not true, that everybody knows are not true, contradicts himself constantly, and so on. Does Mr. Mueller have reason to think that that has interfered with his ability to perform the function that he was assigned, namely to investigate whether Trump had committed, either conspired with the Russians to deform the presidential election, or that he had engaged in obstruction of justice. Since Trump refused to be interviewed, is that not itself evidence of obstructing justice? And I mention all this because the dangerousness of Donald Trump arises from the fact that he is the president. If he were simply a private citizen, he would not be, 1/1000th as dangerous to the public or to the world as he is as president. Now, in a democracy, the only way we can remove a president from office is through legal and political means. And that's why Mr. Mueller's activities here are so important. All we can do as psychiatrists is make suggestions, recommendations, and ask questions. But the major work has to be done by people in Mr. Mueller's position. So I'd like to know what more evidence would he have needed to assume that Mr. Trump was obstructing justice, or did he in fact reach that conclusion and fail to refer him for indictment simply because the Department of Justice refused to allow him to be able to do that?
Okay, Dr. Gilligan, thank you very much. We will recapitulate the 5 questions, the 5 critical questions we have for Mr. Mueller, which are: number 1, given the glaring signs, did you consider a capacity evaluation prior to interviewing the president? Number 2, over the 30 or so times that Mr. Trump answered, he did not recall answers to your questions. Did you ever consider his claim of inability to recall as deceitful? Number 3, given the president's many traits that are commonly shared with violent individuals, did you not consider it prudent to recommend a violence risk assessment? Number 4, did the evidence in your report that Mr. Trump has difficulty knowing the difference between truth and lies affect your decision not to call in the president for an in-person interview? And number 5, as a prosecutor, do you see a nexus between the president's hate speech and incitement to violence and danger to others as targets of his rhetoric? These are the 5 questions that we would like to propose for Mr. Mueller. And based on these, we invite questions from the public. We see that several questions have already come in. We have also had some questions that were emailed in, and perhaps we'll start with those. The first question is, don't you think you should have asked, Mr. Mueller, during your long investigation, were you aware of, or did anyone bring to your attention the best-selling book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump? If yes, did you or anyone on your staff read this book and consider its implications for your investigation in view of the serious dangers to the country because of Mr. Trump's major psychological, mental problems? If no, don't you think when a historic number of leading psychiatrists in our country felt the imperative to publish such a book because of their unprecedented fears about a president with such severe mental problems, that at least you should have been aware of their conclusions on behalf of the American people? Now, would anyone like to answer that question?
Well, I think it would have been useful for Mr. Mueller to have read that book and to been able to know how dangerous the president was and how important his work was to work swiftly and to get it out to the public. Instead, the report was delayed by Mr. Barr and misinterpreted by Mr. Barr to the public. But I think having that book would have been helpful.
I would just add that I think the first volume talks about all the links between the Trump campaign and the Russian interference. It is unable to reach a conclusion about actual coordination, understanding the dangerous, deceitful, impulsive, hurtful, harmful characteristics of Mr. Trump's behavior might have informed an understanding of the extent to which the links with the Russians were real and active, even if not explicit or in paper.
Well, I might add to the comments of my distinguished colleagues, the challenge that being confronted with repeated voluminous lies presents to an investigator, whether it be a psychiatric or a congressional investigator, in the sense that it suggests two kinds of ways of assessing it. Either the person who repetitively and characteristically says things that are provably wrong, not true, and self-serving, either that person cannot distinguish between reality and their preferred view of reality, they're severely mentally impaired, or they are entirely lacking in integrity and trustworthiness because the things that they're saying are demonstrably false, but they're relying on this notion that they could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any support. And that's as frightening, if not more so, than a person who simply can't tell the difference between what's true and what isn't.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next question. And just as a reminder, could people use the chat function rather than email in questions, because emails are pouring in now. Next question. The president just threatened to kill 10 million Afghans in less than a week. Killing on such a magnitude can only be accomplished by nuclear weapons. Since the use of nuclear weapons against insurgents is unviable, the real target of his threat is Iran. I don't think we can afford to be quiet about this. The insecurity of this man will be the ruin of humanity if he is not stopped. Wow.
Certainly a true statement.
Are there any other responses?
I just think several of us have commented, Dr. Gilligan does this very eloquently, that we have failed to come to grips with the extent of the danger that Mr. Trump presents. I hope that perhaps Mr. Mueller, given his noble reticence to go beyond the domain of the report, will recognize that there's an extraordinary danger here that may require extraordinary actions that he is able to make to help Americans see their way through to some sanity in the situation we face.
I think I could only agree with what my colleagues have been saying, that President Trump is dangerous to an unprecedented degree in our history and in world history. And in a way, he's equally dangerous, whether it's that he's what technically is called being a psychopathic liar, that is somebody who just tells lies all the time for self-gratification and self-aggrandizement, or whether he's actually out of touch with reality, either because he's psychotic or because he's mentally defective. I mean, all these possibilities, frankly, alarm me virtually as much. If those are any of the processes that are going on with Trump, any of them, I think, are reason that we need to find a way. By we, I mean the public, because we are a democracy, and through our elected representatives, find a way to save this country and the world from the danger that he represents, through the legal and political means that our Constitution and our form of government provides us with. I can't think of a more important reason for our elected representatives to find a way to remove this man from office, and from the voting public to remove him from office if he still is in that office at the time of the next election. This is a responsibility we all have as citizens and voters.
Thank you, Dr. Gilligan. The next question is, I'm curious about his evangelical base. Why are they so devoted to a president who is almost the antithesis of principles they claim to value? Doesn't this contradiction create intense anxiety in his religious followers? Would anyone like to take that question?
I think there's a selective factor going on. If there's one thing that the evangelicals want that Trump supports, that overwhelms all the other things about him. And the evangelical ministers, which I've watched in action, are focusing not on his sins, but on forgiving his sins, because they have an agenda they want to push through against the will of the majority of people in this country. If you want to establish a religious state, you need a charismatic leader who will then overwhelm the will of the people.
And I have noted in many places that having a mentally impaired president does not mean he's simply disabled, that he would actually be quite masterful in other destructive ways and rallying through frenzied, irrational support of an entire portion of the population is one thing that we might see in a mentally impaired individual. Any other comments on that one?
I would just add very briefly that we also may want to be careful about overgeneralizing from the religiously identified folks who are getting attention to perhaps many, many other deeply religious folks who aren't.
Yes. Now the next question is, are Trump's racism and xenophobia a symptom of his mental illness? First of all, let me state that we are not commenting on the presence of mental illness or not. We're seeing signs of impairment, and we have made a conclusion about his incapacity, but we are not making a diagnosis here, and therefore we will try to answer from that angle. Would anyone like to take that question?
Well, I think, as you point out, we can't answer that question. We have to know more about his real mental state, and a personal exam and other tests is what's necessary for that.
I think what we can say, though, is that racism and xenophobia in the country and in large segments of the public are very dangerous phenomena. That goes way beyond Donald Trump himself. But what we're seeing is how he has succeeded in stimulating racial prejudice and a fear and hatred of foreigners, immigrants, anybody who people identify as a foreigner or an alien. That's what is really dangerous. Why he's doing this, what's going on in his mind, is a whole other question. What I'm alarmed by is the effect he's having on the public. That is what I think is the really dangerous thing.
I could maybe underscore, excuse me, Bendy, for speaking over you, but just to underscore what you said, we are not talking about mental illness. We know that there have been great leaders who functioned magnificently, like Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill, who have dealt with mental illness. We are talking impairment. And even in the case of Donald Trump, his skillfulness, as Jim has talked about, adaptive in the real estate world and might be highly adaptive as a snake oil salesman, but mobilized in the political arena, exploiting paranoia and fear of the other for political purpose. That is the dangerous application of a mental impairment that fits hand in glove with vulnerabilities, insecurities, and conspiracy thinking in the population that preceded Donald Trump and exist afterwards, but it's his execution of them that makes it so dangerous.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Glass. We will state the last question now because we're running out of time. Not for Mueller, but for the panel. Do you think the concept of fear or favor may be what drives the administration and adjacent staff to avoid speaking up or correcting Trump's lies, vitriolic rhetoric, or conduct that places national and international security at risk? I am continually stunned at the amount and lengths of those around this administration will go to avoid confronting reality. I'd like to believe that tweets do not have that much power over one's psyche.
May I say something? I think there are sincere people who are willing to put up with a lot of what's going on, trying to do some good for the country and realizing that if they do one thing that offends Donald Trump, they will no longer have a job. I think they are lying low and trying to protect us. The civil servants who are loyal to the country and not to the president try not to make waves because they know if they do, they'll be removed, as many of his cabinet and many of the other people in the administration have disappeared. His failure to fill many diplomatic posts, many posts in administration, and shrinking the agencies that protect our health and our water and our environment. I think there are a lot of people who are not speaking up, not out of fear, but out of a necessity to be quiet, to keep their job going so they can be there when this man is gone.
Okay, are there any last comments from the panelists? Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining our online town hall, which has been moved from Capitol Hill. We had a room scheduled with everyone who had made plans to travel out here, but instead we decided to do this online town hall. And so thank you for joining us and accommodating us. We here presented what we believe is the most urgent issue of our time. Criminal responsibility is important, but mental incapacity indicates imminent danger that needs immediate intervention in our perspective. So actually one concern that I have is that we're going into a 6-week recess. If there are any Congress members or staff who are watching this, we would urge them to address this issue, perhaps even cancel the recess. This is how urgently we feel the matter is based on a rigorous analysis we have done. So thank you for joining us, and we will try to post more answers to questions online, and the video will be available online. Thank you again for joining us.